I broke into the mainstream around sort of 2011 initially, because I wrote an article which was a front page commentary in the Observer newspaper, which is part of the Guardian Group in the UK. Basically, as the cardiologist was saying, why are we serving junk food to my patients in hospitals? And that was after I'd met with Jamie Oliver, who I'd written to. So I kind of started campaigning on the issues around obesity at that point. And not long after that, Joe, I then had sort of went into a deep dive to try and understand why we had an obesity epidemic. So what was driving that? What was the role of cholesterol in heart disease, overprescription of statins, saturated fat, and essentially that culminated in me publishing a piece in the British Medical Journal in 2013, October, basically, which was titled "Saturated Fat is Not the Major Issue," and suggesting we should be focusing on sugar. We got it wrong on saturated fat. We're over-medicating millions of people on statins. Cholesterol is not that bad as a risk factor for heart disease. And that's really where I sort of broke into the mainstream. And that was, the BMJ Press released it. It was front page of 3 British newspapers. I was on Fox News Chicago, CNN International. And that's really when I started my kind of activism and to try and fight back against medical misinformation and a kind of deep understanding that what was driving poor health for many, many people was biased and corrupted information that was coming from 2 big industries, big food and big pharma.
And that's fairly controversial still today, but backed up by data now. Like that, the talk about saturated fat and the fact that sugar is terrible for you. And now that we know, because the New York Times, New York Times published that expose of those initial scientists that were bribed. I believe it was in the 50s or the 60s. Do you know the whole story?
Yeah,
of course you do. Where they were basically given about $50,000, which is not that much money, to ruin everyone's idea of what's good and bad for you, because they demonized saturated fat in order to preserve sugar. They were paid off by the sugar industry to do this.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. That's really the heart of the problem. It's I would describe it as the corporate capture of medicine and public health. And it's been going on for decades. Yet I think only now, and certainly we'll get into it around the COVID vaccine stuff, I think only now more people are really becoming aware of it. And I think one of the things I discovered when I looked into the whole issue about saturated fat and sugar, et cetera, is, in the sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were 2 scientists who were really at war around what was driving heart disease, because heart disease really started to increase in the United States from 1920 and peaked around 1960, 1970 in terms of death rates from coronary artery disease. And Ansel Keys was the American physiologist from Minnesota who said that saturated fat was a culprit. And then there was John Yudkin, who was a British endocrinologist, nutrition scientist, who basically said that it's sugar. But because the sugar industry was so powerful, they were able to put all of their resources and energy into supporting Ansel Keys, who did take money from sugar industry, it later emerged, and silence John Yudkin. And for decades, we were under this false belief that it was saturated fat that was a big culprit in heart disease. And the other thing to add into this, which wasn't fully accepted or known at the time, was the now acknowledgement that of the impact of smoking. So, it took about 50 years between the first links between smoking and lung cancer that were published in the British Medical Journal before we had any effective regulation on tobacco control interventions, government interventions. And now we know that when you look at the decline in death rates, specifically death rates from heart disease in the last 4 or 5 decades, almost half of that, Joe, can be attributed to reduction in smoking. So these are things that weren't really fully accepted and understood at the time. And the reason for that, and this is really interesting, is the tobacco industry adopted a corporate playbook. I call it a dirty tricks corporate playbook of planting doubt, cigarettes were harmful, confusing the public, denial, and even buying the loyalty of bent scientists. So when there was doctors and public health advocates saying smoking is a problem with the heart, scientists were paid to write articles in medical journals saying it's not smoking, it's stress. People who smoke are more stressed, and it's nothing to do with the cigarettes. So, this is history repeating itself in a way. And denialism, and this is another thing I find quite fascinating. I mentioned this in some of my lectures as well. As late on as 1994, the CEOs of every major tobacco firm went in front of US Congress and swore under oath they did not believe nicotine was addictive or smoking caused lung cancer. Right?
Yeah.
So, all of that was
wild.
thrown in. So once I kind of, as a practicing cardiologist, as a regular frontline jobbing doctor who was seeing, since I qualified, more and more people getting sick, more chronic disease, I started to think, hold on, is there something we're doing wrong as a medical profession? Are we giving the wrong advice? What's actually going on here? And when I did that deep dive and went into the root cause of it, I then realized that, the system, unfortunately, had become increasingly corrupted over many, many years by these powerful commercial entities that whose only interest, for legal reasons, is to produce profit for shareholders, not to look after your health.
Yeah, that's all they really are responsible for. When you did this and you started to talk about diet and health and the misconceptions or misinformation about diet and health, what was the pushback like?
It was huge. I think, for me, so when I published a piece in the British Medical Journal, so it was October 23rd, I'll never forget this, 2013. It got a lot of attention. At this stage, I'm what we call a specialist registrar in cardiology. So I'm not a consultant. I'm not top of my grade yet. I'm finishing my training. I'm almost a fully fledged cardiologist. I'm doing intervention, keyhole heart surgery. And the first thing that happened to me, Joe, which I haven't really spoke about publicly before, is imagine front page of 3 British newspapers, a lot of attention, and a lot of people were happy because suddenly, the front page headline was "Butter is back." Cardiologist says eating butter does not cause heart disease. Right? I know that brings a smile to your face, and I know why. I mean, who doesn't like eating butter? But it was true. It was what the facts told us at the time. So I published this stuff. But what I did at the time is in that 800-word editorial, I basically also went for one of the most prescribed drugs in the history of medicine, which are statin drugs, because I had to make the link of everything. So if saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease, but we know saturated fat can raise cholesterol, that means cholesterol isn't that important. And if cholesterol isn't that important, why are we giving all these people statins? So I was able to scientifically and rationally put all that jigsaw